Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to Recall This Book Collaboration Edition. I'm John Plotz, flying solo today, and along with our upcoming conversation with composer Francisco Del Pino, this conversation is going to inaugurate a series of what it's like to work together, write together, make art together. So coming from a world of lonely makers, so not just the novelists I write about, but all the scholars who study them alone in book-lined rooms, I've always been really jealous of, well, people like my own journalist brother who works with a team to come up with a shared product. So what better way to overcome my own fraternal issues than to interview a prize-winning pair of journalistic brothers, Steve Vineru and Mark Vineru-Wada. Welcome to Recall This Book. It's great to have you.
Thanks, John. Thank you. It's great to be here.
Okay, so I'm going to begin by introducing Steve because he and I have been working together at Princeton this fall, and in fact, like some kind of Graham Greene characters, actually living together in this weird apartment building. We do everything but drink vermouth cassis together at the end of the day. So Steve needs no introduction, or maybe I should say he needs many introductions. I'll just say briefly, he won a 2008 Pulitzer for an amazing series of stories about American private contractors during the invasion of Iraq, and that he, along with his brother, wrote a best-selling book that I'm sure many of our listeners know about the NFL cover-up of concussion trauma, League of Denial, which won a 2014 Penn ESPN Award for literary sports writing. And Mark is equally impressive. I say that even as an older brother, but I have to admit the younger brother is equally impressive. After breaking the bulk of steroids scandal in 2004 and 5 with his colleague Lance Williams, for which he nearly went to jail for refusing to reveal sources, he wrote a 2013 bestseller on that topic, Game of Shadows, Barry Bonds, Balco, and the steroid scandal that rocked professional sports. So apart from your groundbreaking concussion work, both of you have many other fantastic stories in the past and are currently at work on some other stories. For example, I think you're working on the NBA in China that I think are no doubt going to draw further attention. There's a ton to talk about. I want this conversation to go wherever the best stories are, but maybe we can begin at the beginning. And so this beginning I thought of as like, what's the first story you guys worked on together?
I was at ESPN already, and Steve thankfully joined. They were doing a big push to hire, a bunch of really talented writers, and they hired Steve, not long after he'd won his Pulitzer, and I had gotten assigned a story that ended up sort of hatching League of Denial, and in the course of doing the reporting on that book, Steve had just gotten hired. I came back from doing the reporting on that story. And I told Steve about the experience and how somebody had suggested we write a book about the NFL and brain damage. And Steve had already written two and, is really good at conceiving books and as stories as books. And so we sort of shared this idea and then put together a proposal. And in the course of doing that, we started to work on the book together, and we're also working on stories for ESPN. ESPN was supportive of the project. And so we ended up, in addition to the reporting for the book, we were producing stories. So I don't know exactly what the first story is. Do you remember?
I think it was the story about how when we started to report the book, and so we were doing a lot of traveling for the book, and we went to interview a lawyer who represented the first NFL player who was later diagnosed with neurodegenerative disease, Mike Webster. And
did you guys go together because you always travel together, or was it a special?
Well,
it seems like a big deal for two reporters to go out. So.
It's interesting because we do seemingly usually travel together.
Yeah.
We went to Morgantown, West Virginia. And this guy was operating out of like a kind of a converted firehouse. And so we were just almost like at that point familiarizing ourselves with the story. And this guy pulled out a bunch of documents related to a disability case that he had filed against the NFL. So he pulls out these documents, and we could tell immediately that the NFL had been handing out. They've been handing out millions of dollars in benefits to NFL players who had been diagnosed with neurodegenerative disease related to their playing careers, while at the same time the league very publicly and emphatically was denying that NFL players ever get brain damage. And that was, among other things, it was the central focus of a class action lawsuit filed by players against the NFL. So I think that was our first story. We wrote it as a news story for ESPN. I mean, I would say that, like, even though we hadn't worked together before any of this, and we had been working as journalists for both of us, for well over 2 decades at that point. We were constantly talking. We're really close and sharing ideas, and we had talked about wanting to work together. And we had edited each other's stories.
Wow.
I helped edit Mark's first book, and so we did a lot of stuff together. So I don't think actually, I mean, it was great that we were we always wanted to do a book together, so it was great that we were finally doing it. But I think actually the process itself, it didn't feel that unusual, like that revelatory, because I think we had been talking about journalism together for so long that it really came naturally to us, particularly the reporting.
Yeah, I think the reporting especially. Yeah, because I think that's right. The book, I think, is a different animal, but the reporting for sure was pretty natural. And we fell into a groove of the sort of areas we either felt more comfortable in or people we knew that we were going to call, and the sources sort of separated pretty naturally, almost in an odd way. It was pretty natural, strangely.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that about this sort of sorting out. So how would you divide that? Because I know in any collaboration there's implicit division lines, but what did you sit down and sort of draw that out, or how do you figure out how to share it out?
I mean, I think there was different animals for the book. It was an entirely sort of different process, but for stories it seemed to sort of almost organically happen. I mean, we just sort of developed a series of sources between us, and then if there was a question of who was going to call who, we would just say, hey, here, you take these 3 and I'll take these 3 or whatever. And we were constantly talking about the story, so we were always on the same page, and so I don't think, and I also think we've talked about this a bunch around, both with ourselves and other colleagues, that so much of this kind of reporting is really about trust. Mm-hmm. I think when you're working with somebody else, and if you don't trust the person, that's just massive. And so with us, we had a built-in level of trust. Obviously, it made it so much easier. And so I think that...
Wait, Mark, can I just jump in? Because when you first said trust, I assumed you meant between yourself and your sources, but you actually mean between the people. Can you say more about
totally.
that?
No, I mean the trust between you and your colleague. I just think that's, because if you don't, the process, I think this is true of any reporting, but on these stories, there's a delicate nature in some ways of the investigative quality of them. And sometimes you're talking to people who are really reticent to talk. And so I think that you and your colleague have to be on the same page about how you approach people, or at least about sort of the nature of where the story's headed. And if you don't, I think if you don't have that trust, it just makes the process dramatically more difficult. And I almost think impossible.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Because journalism in particular, I think this is probably true of just about any collaboration, but also sort of any work of journalism or probably even writing. I haven't written any fiction, but it just involves a series of endless choices that you're making all the time, constantly, choices around the reporting, choices about what you're going to emphasize in the book. Choices about where you're going to go and when you're going to do it. It's just endless. They're just coming at you constantly. And so if you don't have a partner who you trust implicitly and can have a dialogue that is based on sort of trust and mutual respect, the project is dead.
Of course, as you guys started talking, I realized that as journalists, you've had lots of reporting partners over the years who are not your brother. So is there something you could say specifically about, the difference of having a partner where the emotional bond is there and it's not going away?
That's really an interesting question, because I've had a mix of experiences, and it's funny because I think this process, I think the emotional bond with Steve is, obviously very different than I've got with anybody else I've worked with. And so, but at the same time, as the younger brother, I have all sorts of insecurities around that. And so, not that I never thought that Steve was not going to stay my brother and stay friends and stay close with me if this didn't work somehow. But I think that there was an added element of pressure to the process that I didn't feel necessarily with, say, my colleague who I worked on Game of Shadows with.
Yeah.
Because it's just a different level of pressure to perform and to deliver and all of those things. I mean, we've had this conversation in various ways over the years, and Steve hates it. He despises this part of the conversation.
He's just impatient.
Because he's impatient and he thinks it's sort of bullshit. But it's my reality, so he has to live with it.
I'm not, I'm not in any way like denying your reality.
Yeah.
I'm just.
Yeah, so I think it
sounds like a League of Denial.
So it creates a different animal for sure.
Yeah,
I think it's I think on the one hand, it emboldened the partnership for sure, like 100%. The types of things that Steve just described, we never had. I can't think of one instance really where we had a sort of fundamental disagreement about what the story was or how we were going to pursue the book or how to move forward. And I think a lot of that has to do with the sort of bond we share and that connection. On the other hand, I think the thing I talked about earlier and the insecurities around being a younger brother created its own level of tension that at one point, it didn't threaten to implode the book, but it certainly created a really difficult sort of period of time for me.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I've been trying to get my brother to write this book with me for a long time, and that's actually really helpful because he has lots of good reasons. He is much busier than I am, but I wonder, I always feel like there's some added element of why he doesn't want to do the project. I don't know. It also made me think that there's this wonderful description. Max Weber has this argument about how capitalism evolved in northern Italy because there were all of these kinship networks between the cities where people could rely on each other. Like you could do business with your cousin in Florence if you lived in Venice in a way that you wouldn't do business with some random dude in Florence.
Yeah, you were asking about the sort of, what happens when it doesn't work. The flip side of that is when it does work, when you're working with somebody where the collaboration is really pure, it's just the greatest thing. I really like collaborating. I think, I don't know if I like it more than working alone, but it's just such a qualitatively different experience of doing journalism. And there's something about when you're in sync with somebody of being able to sort of, screen your ideas and just sort of riff and get some feedback and know that you're not going to be judged or that maybe you are going to be judged, but it's not really going to be something that's personal.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm doing a book with someone else right now, and it's a totally different relationship, but it is a similar thing. We have an enormous amount of trust in each other, and so the creative process of figuring out how we're going to prosecute this book is it's really, really exciting. And so when it's working, it's basically the opposite of when it's not working. Because it's not working, it's like torture.
Yeah.
And when it is working, it's poetry. It's unbelievable. It's
yeah,
great.
I heard you say that, in a way, you've had 2 decades where you're both, learning how to be reporters. And do you each have a particular mentor, someone who made a huge impact on you of how to be a journalist, how to be a reporter? I'd be interested to see how they chime with one another.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it was Phil Bennett, who was the. I've had several mentors, when I was doing, just sports, but I think the person who really helped me kind of unlock my potential as a journalist was Phil. He was the foreign editor of the Boston Globe when I was the Latin America correspondent. I had met him a few years before. Then he helped bring me to the Post, where I worked as an investigative sports writer first, but then I went to the foreign desk where he was the AME for foreign, and he was he was in that job when I first went to Iraq, and then he became the managing editor. And I think more than anything, like he really, I think like, if I had to sort of like think of like what my strengths are as a journalist, one of the biggest ones is my ability to kind of see stories, and conceptualize them, sort of see what they might be, and how to execute them. Yeah. And I basically learned that from Phil. Yeah. Like he just thinks at a completely different level than any editor I've ever met, and I've seen him do that for other. I'm not unique in that respect. Yeah. I've seen him do that for other.
So it's like a kind of an X-ray vision, like you see the bones underneath. Like there's all
I think like I can see like I think they're I think I'm somehow able to take topics or like shards of information and kind of piece them together and conceptualize them in a way that they could make for an interesting story, or in this case our book, or
it's 100% true.
It seems, I feel
I'm so envious of the quality.
But I learned that from Phil. Like, I don't think I would have that if and it's a really, I mean, of skills to have as a journalist, I feel really lucky to have it because, it's just, it helps you pick stories. Like the stories you pick is so, it's so important. Yeah. If you stick yourself with a story that you don't really feel passionately about, or it's just kind of a dog of a story, or you can't do, you're sort of sunk. And
so wait, those are three categories. Yeah. The ones you don't feel passionately about, ones that are a dog, meaning like it turns out not to be that interesting.
Well, that happens, especially with investigative reporting.
Yeah, and then the third one is the one that you can't do. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, there's some stories that just, for whatever reason are unmakeable, Like, I mean, I say this to...
Because there's some vital piece of the jigsaw that's missing, or...
You don't have enough time, or you just can't get the information that you need. It can be any number of factors. But I think one of the biggest things is not being able to see it. If you can't see the story, you can't really do it. Yeah. And, and so I find myself a lot of the time, just sort of kind of talking and thinking about, okay, well, what actually is what is it that we're after? What is it that we want to really say? Yeah. Can we actually get that story? Like that. We have probably like half of our conversations are about that, really. And I find myself having those conversations, especially now with my students. Mm-hmm. Like, they have 12 weeks, these are the parameters. Many of them are just starting out, so they have to pick well, do something because I feel like if you're not passionate, they have to be passionate about what they're writing about. Yeah. Because that's another way, I think, to just completely torpedo a story. Like, if you don't believe in it yourself, or you're not really into it, you're not curious about it. Yeah. It's just going to be, at best kind of flat. Yeah.
I hope we get back to talking about teaching, actually, because I want to ask you about Mark if you've taught too. But I want to hear about your mentor first.
There's sort of, I don't know, I'll cop out and sort of say three things that led me to sort of where I am, like, or how I've been able to be somewhat successful. I think one is, one's Steve. Pretty obviously. I just think it's sort of like clear and Steve's 3 years older than I am, and this is an extension of my second. Like we in high school, we had this amazing journalism program, and so my teachers, the two people who taught me, Sylvia Jones and Don Brown, were 100%. In addition to Steve, the reason I decided to do this, and I wanted to get into it. And it was like a legitimate, as I look back on it now, it was a legitimate entry into journalism at the high school level. Wow. They really were pushing the idea of how to do this in a professional way. And so, and they were just so passionate about it and cared about it so deeply. And then as little brother, I was always watching sort of Steve and where his career was going and the level of passion he had. And then over the years, being able to have conversations with him, not only about stories, but about my career and how to shape my career and how to move and change. I think those were fundamental sort of parts of my development. And then I think, on the steroid story I worked on, I ended up working with Lance Williams, and I didn't really know Lance when we started working, other than just as a colleague at the Chronicle. And
this is the San Francisco Chronicle.
This is the San Francisco Chronicle.
And what was your high school in Marin? But no,
it was in Marin. It was Redwood High School.
Okay,
yeah,
all right.
Yeah, Redwood High School, the Redwood Bark.
Okay.
We're the Redwood Bark.
It's worse than its bite.
Yes, exactly. And so with Lance at the San Francisco Chronicle, I mean, we ended up partnering on, what I think he thought was going to be a couple of months of reporting, and ended up being several years of reporting, including our book. And he just, he had both a different sensibility about the way he went about the job than I did, in terms of, he's just this very mellow, laid-back guy who is really sort of quirky and humorous, but is just ridiculously dogged. Mm-hmm. And so, watching the level, not only of his persistence, but he covered cops in courts previously. And so I didn't have a lot of experience in that area. Yeah. So being able to watch him and learn about everything from document hunting to maintaining sources, those were all sort of critical things for me. And so it's sort of a
maintaining sources in this sense means like keeping someone who will keep talking to you.
Lance is really good at this. I had never really processed this that much, but he's always really good about talking about, once he'll establish a source, and then on one story, and then years later, and this actually became really critical in our reporting. He had a source that he developed like 25 years earlier on a totally separate story, and he'd maintained a relationship with that guy for 25 years, oftentimes not writing stories about what they were talking about. And but that guy ended up being a critical source for us in the reporting.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's really interesting. He talks about that all the time, how he's just that kind of guy. He just sort of, maintains a hold on people. Yeah. It's pretty interesting. So
Steve's phrase is like seeing the whole story. Is yours about like the details?
I don't have any. I don't know what my thing is. I mean, I think if I have something, it's a level of persistence. Yeah. Instead of calling one person, I'm going to call 6.
Yeah.
Or and sort of just continuing to badger people in a nice way, not in a like pain in the ass kind of way, or trying to be a nice person or whatever. And so I think that's probably my thing, I guess, if I have a thing.
Yeah, he's kind of shortchanging it. Like, so his, if I had to define sort of what his thing is, it's really like, it's not only the sort of like what he's describing, which is true, but I mean, a lot of people have that. There's a certain ingenuity around it that, around sort of like the capturing of information, and also being able to do it in a way that is completely disarming. That's really rare. Investigative reporters, they're kind of a type, really, and and a lot of them are I think, not to generalize, but I think there is a sort of like, very aggressive, single-minded, quality that, can be extremely beneficial. I think Mark has that, but he's able to balance it and just completely disarm people. And I think that's one of the reasons why they were able to break a story that basically the entire country was trying to chase. And, so yeah, it's not, don't listen to him really. Yeah. I'm really glad though he mentioned our like the Don Brown and Sylvia Jones who were also my teachers in high school. Yeah. I mean, I figured out what I wanted to do when I was like 15. Yeah. And I learned it through them, and I never really like,
Yeah, I wish I had someone.
I mean, it's unbelievable. Like there was never any like, I'd never thought about really doing anything else.
Yeah.
And it was really because of them. And yeah, we're really fortunate in that respect.
Yeah. And they're still around.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So I want to sort of take what you guys are saying and connect it to, this is something that Steve, you mentioned when you presented your sort of fellows talk, which is that one of the challenges you guys have faced is reporting people who really don't want stories to come out. And I don't mean individual people, but like, or you're going up against organizations like the NBA right now, but clearly the NFL, maybe the U.S. Army or the U.S. State Department. That's a challenge, and I just wanted to hear you guys think about that. It's like different, the relationship between your stories and these large structures that could pose a threat to you, that don't want this information dislodged. How do you think about that, and what are the tools you have to go into that?
That's a part of the job that I love. That, like, I think that's the thrill of the job. Is not, I find it much more powerful when we're chasing stories that have to do with institutions than individuals, and I think it's not. I don't think I've ever felt threatened by the process. I think I felt emboldened by the process more than anything, because it sounds very corny, but I feel like this is in its perfect form. This is what the journalism is supposed to be about, right? Like, you should be holding these institutions accountable. And so there's a thrill in being able to do that. I think getting through that bureaucracy, I think, can be really difficult at times. But I don't know. I think, a lot of people are very critical of ESPN for all sorts of reasons, sometimes very good ones. And but I think the reality of the place we're at is, like, we're writing about our business partners pretty regularly, massive business partners. I mean, the NFL, ESPN pays the NFL $2 billion a year, right? $2.5 billion a year. Billion for the rights to air Monday Night Football.
Yeah.
And other, related shows. And so I found the idea of being able to do a book that cut to the core of the league's presence, thrilling, not intimidating, not fear-inducing. And I don't think that's because I'm like it's the courageous thing. I just think, like, that's the journalism, I don't know. That's a sort of simplistic answer probably, but that's sort of how I feel about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, it's like that's part of the thrill. You're like two guys just kind of rooting around, and in our case, the NFL was not thrilled with what we were doing, and I don't know that they actively tried to. Well, I guess when it came to the film, they actively tried to stop us. But like, it just feels like I don't want to, like, say this cavalierly or sort of like in a kind of dismissive way. I think this is just kind of part of the deal, right? It's like you have a situation where there's a major public health issue that thousands, if not millions, of people are trying to understand, so they can make decisions either about their own lives or about their kids or whatever. The NFL is the biggest actor in this drama, and so figuring out kind of how they're handling it and what they're doing, that just feels like journalism 101 to me, really. And so, I mean, we were very transparent with the NFL. I mean, we told them what we were doing. We went to New York and we tried to persuade them to cooperate with our project, and ultimately they wouldn't do it. I mean, I never took it personally. I mean, it's a massive corporation. Like, I mean, I think I probably said this in that talk, like, in my experience, like, when it comes down to these kinds of issues, whether it's the NFL or the State Department or any other sort of massive entity, Like it's the whatever that entity is, its instinctive reaction is to hunker down, defend, attack. That's sort of what these things do almost universally, and it just feels like it's part of the deal to me.
But it is also like, it's sort of a thrill, right? Like we work at a network in which 99% of the material on the network is either sort of celebratory of sport, or at least just airing the sport. And I'm not critical of that. That's what pays our salaries.
Yeah.
But then to be able to sort of like flip that a little bit and do something that takes a hard look at those leagues is, it's thrilling.
Yeah. Well, so what about, you guys are the experts, so you will correct the nature of the question, but it's like what about when you're breaking those questions about institutions? Like, Steve, I'm thinking about your series in Iraq about the contractors. You're talking about the institution, but you're doing it by way of individuals. Like, you're kind of going through individual stories.
Right.
Does that pose its own particular set of ethical quandaries? Because you're aiming at that larger structure, but the cracks you're going through have to do with people's individual stories. Does that?
What would be the ethical issue?
I don't know. You have to name names of particular people who are involved. I was really aware of this with that the Patrick Radden Keefe book, Empire of Pain, where he's getting at he's getting at the Sackler family, but he has to do it by blowing open particular moments where people did humiliating things, like take money to write an article or something.
Yeah.
And you can tell that he's not angry. He's not like interested in that person. He's interested in the network of deceit that was going on behind it.
Yeah.
But you have to go through the person because you have to open the story. So I guess, I don't know. Maybe the answer is you only tell the positive stories that help you get at the negative, but
I don't know. I don't know. In the case of that story, I had been in Iraq for, 2 years at that point. And, I had written positive stories. Then the war wasn't going well, so a lot of negative stories and a lot of sort of neither, right? Just stories. Yeah. And, so this was just a phenomenon that I had, noticed was out there, that there was this large group of sort of, mercenaries basically who were, had carte blanche to run around the battlefield and do whatever it was that they were doing. Like, I don't think I really understood what their role was. Except in a very kind of general way. Yeah. And so when I got into it, my first, my first goal was to understand that. And the only way to do that was through individual stories, to like go to companies and ask people like, why are you there? What do you do? How much are you paid? What is your contractual relationship with the U.S. government or the State Department? Yeah. Like, what are the rules of engagement? How much violence have you experienced? Just like all of that stuff was a complete mystery to me. And when I got into it, it became, it did not take an investigative reporter to see that the whole thing was like completely out of control. And, and once that happened, I had to go to the institutions because the institutions were technically, the ones who were overseeing this entire, system that had emerged, within the sort of inside the war. Yeah. And so I didn't feel, that just felt like a kind of a natural thing.
I know, but I think to John's question, if I'm getting it right, like, so, you end up developing close relationships with some of those people, the individuals, right? And some of that stuff is not some of the things they're doing or involved in, or the dynamic that they're involved in is not necessarily reflecting that great on them. And so, if I'm understanding correctly, I think you're getting at this question of like, how do you balance that idea of, you're developing these sources who want to cooperate you and be helpful, but they're not always going to look that great themselves.
Yeah, I guess, it's sort of it becomes a little bit more complicated, sort of like the I think the sort of the less authority that people have. Like, you know, for the contractors themselves, like I never felt any, I guess, like judgment around them taking the job, because to me they were no different than like lobbyists who had worked in government and then were capitalizing on their skills. Like these were almost universally people who had been in the military and were making like 10 times as much money as they did in the military doing exactly the same job with less oversight and supervision. Yeah. So it was just like, I didn't have any real judgment, and it was sanctioned by the US government. So I had zero, but what happened within that framework was, you know, a lot of really reprehensible things. And so to the extent that people were getting involved, you know, and being, you know, paid essentially by taxpayers, and they were getting involved in activities that were, you know, that were problematic, then I don't really have any problem writing those things. I mean, there were people that I wrote about who I really ended up being close with, or being close with their families. And, you know, and so I think some of the material that ended up in, you know, in particularly my book was difficult, I think.
Yeah.
But I think the relationships were such at that point that they knew what was going in the book, and I talked about it with them, and they had not themselves done anything. Like I wasn't accusing anything.
Yeah.
Like,
but I think that's I do think the critical piece to that is a level of transparency, because I think being transparent with those sources early on about where this is going to go and the potential for how it's going to look and all of that, but also describing your own motivations is really sort of a key piece to convincing people to talk to you, that there's a reason to talk to you, even if it's going to prove to be uncomfortable.
Yeah. I feel like you guys are putting a finger on something really important here, which is that your role as investigative reporter and ultimately like journalist writing it up is like partly you have your own set of judgments about how you feel about people. But like what you were describing, Steve, about like the people who take this higher paid job working, you know, outside the military structure, and you're saying you have no judgment against them, but your job as a reporter is partly to tell their story. And I just know that there are people who do read that, and they don't pass judgment against the institution. They think they focus on the individual, but in a way that suggests you're doing your job right, which is like you're making it available for people to feel one way or the other about these people.
Well, I think that, like, you know, I mean, we learned this with the NFL. I mean, there are certain truths that people just do not want to hear.
Yeah. You
know, like when we were writing the NFL book and we started going on the radio, you know, people were asking us like, why do you guys want to kill football?
Yeah.
You know? And we were like, you got to be kidding me. Like, really? And you know, and I think it's just because, you know, people get very protective you know, around the war or around the sport.
But Steve, you and I have gone back and forth on this about football. I think it's a really interesting one. And Mark, I'd love to hear your thoughts too, because like I shared with Steve that my brother just doesn't want to hear about concussions at all. He loves watching football. Yeah. He watches it with his son. It's great. He doesn't want to see it. Now, you guys, I know, are football fans, and yet you wrote this story about this incredible impact. And so my brother doesn't want to hear it. I do want to hear it, but the result of my wanting to hear it is that I don't want to watch football anymore. Yeah. But you guys want to hear the story, you broke the story, and yet you also still love football.
There's a level of our own denial, I think, for sure. I mean, it's funny because I think, you know, people, I think one of the values of the reporting, not just ours, but any, is that you're exposing people to truths and people can then make their own decisions about it. And I certainly don't have any judgment for anybody who decides after finding out the level of exposure that, like, I can't be a part of that. I can't contribute to that.
Like, I'm dreading the day when the concussion data comes about soccer, and it turns out, because if that happened, I don't know what I would do. I would just weep. You know, watch cricket. I don't know.
Well, they've already eliminated heading for young people too.
Believe me, I know.
Yeah. But I don't know. I think that they're amazing athletes. The sport's incredible, and I find myself. I think I watch differently than I used to, for sure, and I cringe in different ways than I used to. But I'm more. I don't know. I find myself more bothered by the league's sort of like belief that the world begins and ends with them than sort of anything else, than the other issues. Their dealings with things like Kaepernick and their dealings with things like,
Domestic violence.
Domestic violence.
Yeah.
And, I'm more, the concussion issue is, it's not that it's over, but, it has now been exposed in a fairly wide way. And if a player's playing, they understand it. I think it's a different question at the youth issue, at the youth level. But for the NFL, it is sort of what it is. And the sport isn't an inherently violent sport. That's what it is. And so I think you just have to understand that and accept it.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So we're sort of pivoting towards the end here, but I really wanted to ask you guys, just sort of continuing this topic of reporting up, against these big institutions. You're working on the NBA in China now, right? So
we did it.
We have.
Do you feel like you're done? Oh, is that it? Or are you?
We're done on. I don't know if we're done on China. We might be done on China, but we're still really interested in the NBA and but we did a lot on China. We've done several stories on China. Yeah.
So sort of same. Do you have the same general conclusion there? Like you haven't felt personally threatened at all? It doesn't feel impacted? No.
The only time I ever...
Were you scared of Adam Silver?
No.
Terrified
of it. No. I think the only time I've ever... And it was not... I didn't feel physically threatened. The only time I ever felt any level of really deep, ugly hatred was around the steroid stuff. Because the level of emails we would get and phone calls and messages is just vitriol. I mean, it was just like, and most people, email emboldens people, right? They just feel like you don't exist as a human. And so they'll just say absolutely anything. And so Giants fans who hated the reporting because we were reporting largely on Barry Bonds, they just were, and then when we were looking at a possible prison sentence for the reporting, that emboldened people even more to say all sorts of crazy stuff.
But you didn't get that with the concussion stuff.
No,
we
didn't. We got a lot of, like Steve said, why do you hate football? Or why are you trying to kill football? Or that kind of stuff, but not the kind of vitriol we got on bonds and steroids.
It's funny to me that the question is honestly kind of amusing to me.
Yeah.
Like somehow the NFL is gonna are you worried about the NFL what they're gonna do to you?
Well, I will say as an academic with China, I'm really worried about academic freedom stuff because I've seen that at my university. The Chinese government is trying to use funding as a lever.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
I think that but there was sort of it's almost like in the Will Smith movie where the NFL is supposedly following people around, that stuff. The NFL is not going to be they're not that sinister, they're a corporation, so they're protecting they're protecting their business, but they're not, I never felt threatened by them. I mean, the most we got threatened really was when they, when they tried to, when they pressured ESPN to withdraw from the documentary, and that was super uncomfortable for sure. But it wasn't it wasn't I felt in Iraq or anything like that. And I mean, there were, I think there were issues in Iraq, not so much around the institutions actually, because the institutions respond institutionally, so when the NFL put pressure on ESPN to get out of the documentary, that to me was an institutional response designed to protect the relationships with the business partner, protect their brand, all of that stuff, which, and I feel but, in Iraq, there was just a lot of it's just, there were not a lot of rules, and so I don't think I ever felt physically threatened by a particular person, but the environment, in which you were doing the reporting was obviously,
the environment being a war.
Yeah. I mean, well, you're trying to do investigative reporting.
Yeah.
But I don't think. But I think you're right. I think China. I mean, I think we were. I think as we did the reporting, there were questions around like not our safety, but just like, do we have to worry about this? We were looking a lot of like one story had a lot to do with AI in China, and its use, and so I think we were always talking about, are there issues that we need to be protective of the work, but never physically threatened. And I think that's the same. I mean, I did a story that took me to Russia, and there was a lot of discussion about my phone and all sorts of laptop issues and those kinds of things, but I don't think I can't think of a situation where I felt physically threatened by what we do.
No. I mean, we were trying to be protective of sources,
Yeah, for sure.
And protective of information, for like hacking or surveillance.
Actually, that was the final set of questions that I had for you guys, which is sort of like looking back over a couple of decades, what things have made doing the work you do easier and what things have made them harder. Like, for example, I don't know whether FOIA works better now than it did in the past, or other ways that you get information, things that are advantageous about the world of the net and not having to be in the same place with someone versus disadvantages now.
Good question.
It is a good question. I mean, some of them are basic things. Like, I think, largely the net has made things dramatically easier in a lot of ways in terms of research and finding material and accessing material. And, I mean, there's that famous scene in Spotlight where those guys are rifling through like old phone books or whatever, right? And in the archive at the Boston Globe, and those days are over. Yeah. So that's nice, but and so I think I don't know. I'm not a FOIA expert, but it would be interesting. I mean, it strikes me that institutions are dramatically more emboldened to hold back material, and have become much more legally savvy or found ways to get around it. I don't know how true that is. That's how it feels to me.
Well, the source maintaining that you were describing, Mark, like that thing that you learned from Lance, I guess, about like keeping, does that still hold true? Like,
I think definitely. I think the elements of the job remain like that hasn't changed. Like, it's fundamentally about developing relationships and convincing people to trust you. I mean, there's a different animal around getting documents and finding that material, but I think in terms of getting people to talk to you and keeping sources in the way that Lance has described, or being transparent around why you want somebody to talk to you and giving them a motivation to talk to you. None of that changes, I don't think. I think it's all about developing relationships and trust. I mean, we were talking about trust earlier, and obviously we were talking about in the context of partnerships, but it's fundamental in dealing with sources, obviously. I mean, people have to, I think people generally, a lot of people do want to talk, but they have to trust you, especially in sensitive situations like this.
I think the other thing that's really changed is that, kind of like both the role of the media in society and the perception of the media, like we started off talking about trust, and I don't think there is a lot of trust. Well, there isn't, there's not a lot of trust in the media. It's certainly not in the way when we first got involved, and it's not as, I guess I would say it's like, it's not as treated with the same degree of, I don't know, I guess, respect, the institution of the media. There's just there's been an erosion of that over the last 10 years. And I think that probably, it's hard to know, to quantify, but it feels like that probably has an effect on your ability to do your job.
And it'd be really interesting to circle back to your teachers and see if their students now are still feeling the same thing that you guys felt, like,
Well, I was talking about
they can reach students the same way.
The thing is, it's like, I mean, I showed the first 9 minutes of All the President's Men in my class. It's the 50th anniversary of Watergate. And, so that movie came out in 1976. I graduated from high school in 1980. The media, I mean, people were flooding into journalism schools. People were creating investigative reporting units within their papers. There were people like me and other people who were just like, wanted to be, Carl Bernstein, or, wanted to be really Dustin Hoffman or Robert Redford.
I just want to close one final loop, which is like, Steve, you've been teaching this semester. I don't know, Mark, do you ever do any teaching? So any
I
thoughts
taught
about
high
that?
school for a little bit.
Oh, cool.
And I miss it. And I have an interest in teaching at the college level, but I haven't gotten a gig. So I would love to do it at some point. I think it's, I mean, anybody who wants to get into this world, I think, I just want to help, because I do think it's, as corny as it sounds, it's completely, in its purest, it's an admirable thing to do, and it's critical.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it'd be fun to track your students, Steve, like 10 years from now, see how many of them have ended up as reporters. But,
It's true. How many of you inspired to greatness?
Inspired to throw over their lives for
unclear rewards.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, Steve, thank you guys both very much. This is a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Thanks,
having us.
John.
Recall This Book was founded by Elizabeth Ferry and me, John Plotz. It is sponsored by Brandeis and the Mandel Humanities Center. Sound editing is by Naomi Cohen, website design and social media by Miranda Puri of the English department. We're eager to hear your comments, criticisms, and thoughts. If you liked what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. From all of us here at RTB, thanks for listening.